who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark piece of legislation which prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, and gender in employment, institutions like hospitals and schools, and privately owned public accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, and theaters. In 1954, legal segregation in public schools came to an end due to the Supreme Court's ruling on the Brown v. Board of Education case, which set in motion sweeping changes in American society. Activists like Martin Luther King Jr., James Bevel, and Vernon Johns began to stage protests against widespread racial discrimination. African American leaders across the nation held marches in southern cities along with northern supporters, both black and white. Many of these peaceful protests were met with violent responses with the use of police dogs, fire hoses, and physical abuse of the protesters, which would be covered by the newspaper and magazines, bringing the struggle to the attention of many who remained unaware of the severity of racial discrimination. When John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, the Democratic platform promised equal access for all Americans to all areas of community of life. But progress on the legislation addressed was slow, as Kennedy's main concern was with the Cold War. It wasn't until 3 years into his presidency, by early 1963, that a series of protests would convince JFK to address the nation about civil rights and actively call for its legislation. The most influential being the Birmingham Campaign, or the Children's Crusade, where students and children endured high-pressure fire hoses and police dog attacks during their protests against segregation. Congress considered legislation to address inequality in public accommodations but failed to pass it. Legislators also tried but failed to pass a widespread civil rights law in 1963. This failure would bring about the Great March on Washington, where John F. Kennedy met with the 10 leaders at the White House and felt that the chances of his civil rights bill went up. Those who argued against the law's passage asserted that the remedies proposed by the law were unconstitutional, in violation of the rights of the states to govern their own affairs, and an impermissible infringement on the rights of business owners to decide for themselves with whom to do business. It was only after the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 and the swearing in of Lyndon B. Johnson in his place that the legislative tide turned in favor of passage of civil rights legislation.
Despite all the struggles of bringing the Civil Rights Act to Congress, it finally became a law. The law helped stop discrimination and segregation. The Civil Rights Act started a sea of change in the United States. Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. He made the passage of civil rights his first order of business. Johnson identified himself with the black movement more passionately than any previous president. Johnson used Kennedy's assassination to validate Kennedy's legacy and pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Many Southerners in the House of Representatives argued that the bill was unconstitutional. The House of Representatives approved the bill with a vote of 290 to 130. The bill moved on to the Senate, and Southern and border state Democrats staged a 75-day filibuster. Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, a former KKK member, spoke for over 14 consecutive hours. The filibuster was finally broken, and the Senate approved the bill with a 73 to 27 vote. Even though the Civil Rights Act was passed, racial discrimination was still a part of American life. The act helped stop most local businesses from refusing to serve the people of color. Employers were encouraged or forced to open their doors to applicants of all races and national origins. Employers couldn't discriminate against people based on their religion or sex, too. Segregation on the grounds of race, national origins, or religion was banned. Schools were to no longer be segregated, and federal power was approved to enforce it. All public venues, such as restaurants, theaters, public transportation, resting rooms, gas stations, hotels, and sporting events were to be desegregated. Johnson realized by supporting the Civil Rights Act, he would be risking losing the South's support of the Democratic Party. The South, which had 5 states switch to the Republican Party in 1964, became a stronghold of the Republican Party by the 1990s. The Civil Rights Act later went to bring disabled Americans, the elderly, and women and collegiate athletes under its umbrella. Civil Rights Act changed the way the American people lived. It paved the way for the Voting Rights Act and many other laws.
The Voting Act of 1965 is an act to enforce the 15th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, and for other purposes. Racial problems were huge during this time. Many did not want African Americans or other minority groups to vote. Therefore, it was nearly impossible to pass this law. To bring this law into effect, it was hard enough, but bringing it to Congress is even harder. People fought and even died for this law to be passed. Martin Luther King Jr. was working hard and pushing for this law to be passed. Malcolm X was also a key leader during the early stages of this fight against Congress. Both of these strong leaders were assassinated during and after the fight against Congress. This fight was not only about a law, it was about making peace. In 1965, during the passing of these laws, there were 6 African American members of the U.S. House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate. By 1971, there were 13 members of the House and 1 African American member of the Senate. The Voting Rights Act was pushed off due to the election of President Johnson. Johnson knew if he passed the law, he would not win. Hundreds of people, white and black, gathered together and traveled to Mississippi to help the African American voters. The African American people were given ridiculous tests in order for them to vote. Not many were able to pass. Johnson started losing voters in the South. Many non-violent marches were broken up by police, killing many and injuring more. President Johnson took a stand on March 15, 1965, and made the biggest speech of his career, ending it with, "We shall overcome the racism." On August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed.